Let your eyes close now if they haven't already. Feel the weight of your body settling, the small of your back releasing, your shoulders dropping, your hands going soft and still at your sides. You don't need to hold anything right now, not a thought, not a worry, not even your own sense of where you end and the darkness begins. Just breathe. In through the nose, slow, deliberate, like you're drawing the night air into a room that has been closed too long. Hold it gently and release. Good. You are exactly where you need to be. Tonight, we are going somewhere vast, not a place with borders or a name you can pronounce quickly. We're going to the space between possibilities, to the places that exist in the margins of reality, the unwritten paragraphs of the universe itself. We are going to the multiverse, and before you follow that word into abstraction, let it breathe here first, like smoke from a candle just extinguished. Hang in the air between what is known and what cannot quite be held. The multiverse, as the Ancient One once tried to explain to a brilliant and deeply resistant man in a darkened New York sanctum, is not a theory. It is not a hypothesis chalked on a blackboard awaiting confirmation. It is, in the most fundamental and uncompromising sense, the structure of everything. To understand it, you have to let go of the idea that reality is a single thread, because it was never a thread. It was always a river delta, branching, splitting, finding new channels through the silt of cause and effect, and each branch carrying its own full weight of water, its own full cargo of lives and choices and griefs and small quiet joys. What the Ancient One understood, and what she spent her years in Kamar-Taj trying to teach, was that the multiverse is not a threat to be neutralized. It is a fact to be metabolized. The body has to learn to live with it the way the body learns to live with the knowledge of its own mortality, not by solving the problem, because the problem has no solution, but by finding a way to hold the knowledge without being destroyed by it. Most people, shown the full scope of the multiverse, would experience not wonder but a particular kind of vertigo. The sudden, destabilizing awareness that everything they have built their sense of self upon, their choices, their history, their specific thread of consequence and memory, is one among an uncountable number of equally real alternatives. This is why the Ancient One was selective about what she taught and to whom and when. Not because the knowledge was dangerous in itself, but because the mind that receives it has to be prepared, has to have built, through practice and patience and the willingness to sit with discomfort, a kind of spaciousness inside itself that can accommodate the infinite without collapsing inward. There is a name for what happens when the mind cannot accommodate it. The Ancient One saw it in students who pushed too far too fast, who heard the theory of the multiverse and immediately went looking for confirmation, who tried to cross the threshold before they had learned to stand comfortably at it. The name for what happens is not madness, though madness is the word that gets used. The name is loss of anchor. The sense of self requires a relationship to a specific reality, a specific set of conditions, a specific body in a specific place living a specific sequence of moments. Remove the specificity, open the self too fully to the awareness that none of this is singular or necessary, and the anchor lifts. The self begins to drift. It loses the thread of itself in the threads of everything else. This is what makes the Ancient One's gift so extraordinary and so rare. She had metabolized the multiverse completely. She had achieved the state in which the infinite is simply context rather than crisis. She looked at the full branching structure of all possibility and felt not vertigo but something closer to the way you might feel looking at a very old and very large tree, a sense of scale that is also a sense of proportion, a reminder that the thing you are standing next to has been here much longer than you and will continue long after, and that this fact is not diminishing, but clarifying. You are small. The tree is large. Both of these things are true, and neither of them is a problem. Doctor Strange was not this prepared when he first arrived at Kamar-Taj. He was a man in the middle of a private catastrophe. His hands, the instruments of everything he had built his identity around, were damaged beyond the repair he had come looking for. He was desperate. And desperation, the Ancient One knew, is its own kind of tunnel vision, as incompatible with the full reception of a multiversal truth as any other form of closedness. She taught him anyway. She pushed him through the door of perception before he was entirely ready, because sometimes the door is the preparation. Sometimes the only way to learn to stand in the infinite is to be thrown into it before you have time to be afraid. Picture this. Every decision you've ever made, not just the large ones, but the small ones, the ones you've already half forgotten, created a fork in the road of your own personal timeline. You chose coffee this morning instead of tea. In another branch, the other version of you chose differently, and that tiny divergence sent two nearly identical lives along paths that would grow slowly, imperceptibly apart. Now scale that up, not to the decisions of one life, but to every subatomic interaction in the known universe since the first moment of creation. That is the scope of what the Ancient One understood, and what she spent centuries trying to protect. She did not speak of this lightly. The Ancient One, Tilda Swinton's quiet and slightly terrible presence in the sanctum, the woman who broke every rule she enforced, understood the multiverse as a gardener understands a forest, not as something to be controlled, never as something to be controlled, but as something to be tended, something to be walked carefully through, something that could, if mishandled, fall into a darkness that has a name, the Darkhold's dimension, the realm of Dormammu, the void between branches where nothing grows because nothing was ever permitted to. Breathe again. Feel your chest expand and contract. There is something almost comforting in knowing that the universe is this large, that whatever you carry tonight, the weight of the day, the low hum of something unresolved, exists on one branch, in one timeline, among a number that cannot be counted by any arithmetic currently available to human beings. The sacred timeline. That phrase. Let it sit with you for a moment before we continue. Sit with it. The TVA, the Time Variance Authority, that bureaucratic beige horror staffed by variants pruned from their own timelines and memory wiped into compliance, was built on the premise that there is one correct flow of time, one path through the delta that is permitted to run all the way to the sea. Every other branch, every deviation, is classified as a nexus event, a point of divergence so significant that it threatens the integrity of the whole. And the TVA's job, as Miss Minutes cheerfully explained in an orientation video that felt designed to induce mild sedation, was to identify those branches, send in hunters wearing orange jackets, and prune them, erase them. Delete entire timelines the way you might delete a folder from a desktop with a quiet click and an absence where a universe used to be. What makes this chilling, and what you can let wash over you now, slow and cold as water over stone, is not the violence of it. It is the certainty, the bureaucratic serenity with which entire worlds were unmade, the paperwork filed, the tempad clicked closed, the agents heading home, or to whatever passed for home in the castle outside time. He who remains built this. A version of Kang the Conqueror, a man from the 31st century who understood the multiverse so deeply and so completely that he looked at it all of it, the infinite branching river of everything, and flinched. Because he had seen what happens when other versions of himself find those branches, when other Kangs, brilliant and ambitious and entirely without the particular variety of guilt that he had eventually accumulated, discover that the multiverse is real and decide that it should belong to them. He survived it. More than survived. He absorbed it in the way that only someone who has lost their previous certainty can absorb something that requires you to release certainty entirely. His broken hands turned out to be useful, not because they made him humble. Strange never fully achieved humility in the conventional sense, but because they removed the option of returning to what he was before. He could not go back to being a surgeon. The only direction was forward, into the strange territory of a discipline that required not precision but surrender. And in learning surrender, he found something more powerful than the precision he had lost. The sacred timeline was built on the opposite premise. It was built on the idea that the multiverse can be controlled, not metabolized, not inhabited with wisdom, but reduced, narrowed, compressed into a single strand that can be managed because it has been stripped of all alternative. He who remains controlled the multiverse by eliminating most of it, and what remained was not the multiverse at all. It was a single river channel, artificially maintained, mistaken for the full river by everyone who had never seen the delta from above. The breath you just took is the simplest proof that you exist in one specific branch of the infinite. In another branch you exhaled a fraction of a second later. In another, you had not yet lain down. In another, the room around you is a different colour or a different shape, or does not exist because the building was never built, or was built and was demolished, or stands. But you never came to live in it because you made a different choice at one of the 1,000 forks that led here. The breath you took is real. The room is real. The night is real. And none of these things being real in this branch makes them any less real in any other. The multiverse is not a competition between versions of reality. It is all of them, simultaneously, completely, without hierarchy. He flinched. He built the TVA. He pruned everything back to one manageable stem and called it sacred, and spent what may have been centuries sitting alone in the Citadel at the end of time, playing with a fidget wheel, waiting for the two people he knew were coming. That is the architecture of infinity, reduced to the smallest possible room. One man, one choice, one timeline permitted to exist because all others had been deemed too dangerous to allow. You breathe. The room around you is still. The night is doing its patient work, and somewhere in the space between your last exhale and your next inhale, a version of the universe continues that you will never see, turning on an axis you will never touch, full of people who made different choices and are no less real for it. The multiverse is not coming. It was always already here. We simply haven't had the right lens to see it. And now, slowly, as we move through this story together, we're going to hold that lens up to the light. Rest into the word, infinite. Let it do its work on the tight places inside you. Infinite. There is room. There is always, always room. Let your breathing slow a little more now. If your thoughts are still moving, still sorting, still cataloguing the small debris of the day, that is fine. Let them move. Watch them the way you might watch leaves on water, drifting past without needing to be caught. You don't have to stop thinking. You only have to stop holding on. We return now to the Citadel at the end of time. Picture it the way the show rendered it. A structure that should not architecturally exist, perched at the absolute terminus of the timeline like a barnacle on the hull of a ship that has already reached its destination. Outside its walls, purple void, the death of entropy, the place after the last star goes out. Inside, a man in a purple coat eating an apple with the specific calm of someone who has already seen this scene play out exactly as it will play out. He who remains. The name he gave himself, or perhaps the name that remained after all his other names had been used by other versions of him in other timelines, each of those versions becoming something the original could no longer recognize as himself. He was brilliant. He was tired. He was, depending on how charitably you read his monologue in that final chamber, the one delivered to Loki and Sylvie as they arrived, breathless and armed and full of righteous certainty, either the greatest protector the multiverse had ever had, or its greatest tyrant. And he was fully prepared to argue that these were the same thing. His origin is the 31st century. By that point, human civilization had developed sufficiently to confirm what the Ancient One had understood through mystical intuition. The multiverse exists. It is real, and it contains other versions of you. Not metaphorical other versions. Actual, material, breathing alternates who lived the lives your choices closed off. A scientist in the 31st century named Nathaniel Richards made this discovery, and like most discoveries of this magnitude, it began with wonder. He made contact with his variants. He exchanged knowledge across timelines. For a period that may have lasted years or decades, the multiverse was a place of extraordinary communion. Versions of the same extraordinary mind pooling everything they knew, building towards something unprecedented. The 31st century, as the MCU has begun to sketch it, is a time of extraordinary technological achievement and equally extraordinary ethical immaturity. This is not an unusual combination in the arc of civilizations. Capability tends to outpace wisdom at every significant threshold. The first humans who mastered fire could not have predicted forest fires. The first humans who split the atom had not finished developing the philosophical frameworks to think about what they were releasing. Nathaniel Richards discovered that time was traversable before his civilization had developed any adequate language for what that meant, what it cost, what it was permitted to do. His first contact with his variants was, by his own account, a period of genuine joy. The experience of meeting yourself, not a reflection, not a memory, but an actual alternative version of the same fundamental intelligence shaped by different conditions into a slightly different form, is something almost no being in history had experienced before him. He described it, in whatever records survive, as the resolution of a loneliness he had not known he was carrying. The loneliness of being exceptional. The loneliness of being the most capable person in every room, of understanding systems that others find incomprehensible, of thinking 3 moves ahead in every game, and finding no one who can follow the 3rd move even when you explain it carefully. His variants understood. They followed not just the 3rd move, but the 4th and the 5th, and they argued back, which was the thing that felt most extraordinary of all. To be argued with by someone who was your equal, not in the polite social sense, but in the literal cognitive sense. Someone who had access to all the same raw material of mind and had used it to reach different conclusions through different routes. The early days of the Kang Variance communion were the days when the multiverse felt most like a gift, when the branching structure of reality seemed designed specifically to give the most isolated of minds the only companionship that could truly reach them. It is not recorded exactly when the gift became a threat. These transitions rarely are. What begins as admiration calcifies slowly, through the specific chemistry of genius and competition, into something that still contains the admiration, but has added to it a new element, the awareness that the other version of you is not merely a companion, he is also a rival. He has spent the same number of years you have in the same quality of mind, reaching different conclusions, and some of those conclusions are about what the multiverse should look like, who should govern it, which timeline's values should constitute the organizing principles of all the others, and on this question, the variants do not agree, cannot agree, because each has been shaped by his own timeline's version of what is important, what is right, what is the correct answer to the question of how a civilization should be organized when it has access to all of time. Then the war began. It is never entirely clear which version of Nathaniel Richards decided that sharing was insufficient. That communion was only the first step, that if he was the smartest man in his timeline, and the smartest man in every timeline, then surely it followed, in whatever cold and perfectly logical architecture his genius occupied, that there should only be one timeline, and it should be his. The multiversal war that followed is described in the show with appropriate restraint, because its full scope cannot be rendered in any medium that relies on human attention spans. Timelines burned. Variants of Kang, each one a man of staggering intellect wearing a different face of ambition, tore through the fabric of reality in pursuit of one another. What was possible became carnage. What was beautiful became a battlefield. He who remains, the particular Nathaniel Richards who would eventually occupy the Citadel, claims he ended it. Claims he found Alioth, the creature that devours time and matter and anything else that wanders into the void between moments, and weaponized it. Turned a cosmic predator into a perimeter fence, used it to wall off the sacred timeline from the branching chaos and prune everything else back to a single manageable strand. He says he saved us, and sitting in that citadel, smiling his unsettling smile, he is not lying. He did save something, the question that Loki has been trained by centuries of chaos to ask, the question that cuts through certainty like a blade through silk, is, saved it for whom? Sit with that for a moment. The room around you is quiet. Your body is heavy in the good way, the way that means it's releasing something it has been clenching all day. Sit with the question, saved for whom? Because the sacred timeline is not a neutral thing. It is a curated thing. He who remains made choices about which branch would survive. Choices that, by definition, meant deciding which human beings, which civilizations, which entire populated worlds would be permitted to exist, and which would be erased. He never claimed to be just. He only claimed to be necessary. And there is a version of his argument that is genuinely hard to dismiss. If the alternative is infinite Kangs tearing the multiverse apart in an endless war, then one benevolent, or at least merely tired and self-aware, tyrant pruning the branches might be preferable to the chaos. But Sylvie did not find it hard to dismiss. Sylvie, who had been pruned as a child for the crime of existing as a variant, who had spent her entire life running through apocalypses to avoid TVA hunters, who had the particular moral clarity that comes from having had everything taken from you before you were old enough to understand why. Sylvie looked at He Who Remains and saw not a protector but an author, someone who had decided without consultation that his story was the only one worth telling. She killed him, and the timeline fractured, and everything we are exploring tonight became not history, but present tense. The multiversal war that followed is one of those events in Marvel mythology that the story describes primarily through its aftermath, through the shape of what He Who Remains built in response to it, through the specific nature of his solution, through the particular form his trauma took in the centuries that followed. We know the war happened. We know variants died. We know timelines burned. We know Alioth was weaponized and the branches were pruned back. What we cannot fully know, what he who remains himself may no longer fully remember after so many centuries at the end of time, is what was lost. Not what was destroyed, what was lost. The specific things that were not just eliminated but will never be recovered. The cultures, the languages, the particular combinations of circumstance and human effort that produce certain kinds of beauty and that, once erased, leave a gap in the possible that nothing else will precisely fill. He who remains sat in his citadel and played with his fidget wheel and waited for Loki and Sylvie to arrive. And in the long centuries of that waiting, it is worth considering what he thought about. Whether he thought about what he had destroyed. Whether the weight of all those pruned branches was something he carried consciously, or something he had learned to set down so completely that he no longer felt its absence. Whether a man who has made the decisions he made can maintain access to their full cost, or whether the maintenance of sanity requires at some point a certain selective forgetting. The apple he was eating. It is a small detail, and the story does not ask you to do anything with it except notice it. He who remains, at the end of all time, eating an apple. The most powerful being in the history of any timeline, alone at the terminus of everything he controlled, consuming the most ordinary object available. There is something in that image, the man who managed infinity, reduced at last to the simple animal fact of being hungry, that says more about the nature of power than any of his speeches. He was tired, he was bored. He'd been right about everything for so long that being right had lost whatever warmth it once possessed. He sat at the end of time and ate apples and waited for the two people who would end him, and some part of him was grateful. He who remains died with the expression of a man who had known this would happen and had arranged for it anyway. His last words carried the weight of a warning and the lilt of something almost like relief. He told them they'd see him again soon, and he was right. Because Kang does not die. Kang multiplies. There is something in this that mirrors a truth about power that has nothing to do with comics or television. Power that entrenches itself in the name of protection is never simply protective. It is always also afraid. He who remains, for all his certainty and his citadel and his centuries of absolute control, was a frightened man. Frightened of his own other selves, frightened of what they would do if released, and so he built the grandest cage in the history of any universe and called it a sanctuary. Your breath moves in and out. The night holds you. Somewhere in the branching infinite, in one of the timelines that survived the pruning, or in one that grew back after the sacred strand was cut, a version of Nathaniel Richards is still searching for a way to stop the war before it begins, still hopeful, still in the stage before the certainty calcifies into something cold. We will not follow him into the cold tonight. We will stay here in the warmth of the question, in the space before the answer has been imposed. Let the weight of that settle and breathe. The dark is very friendly now, isn't it? Feel how it has softened around you. Whatever tension was in your jaw, let it go. Whatever you were holding in your throat. Your hands are open now, palms loose. The architecture of effort already disassembling itself into rest. You're doing so well. Keep breathing. Before the Multiverse War. Before the Citadel. Before Loki and Sylvie walked into the room that contained the last man who understood everything. There was a moment in a burning, crumbling, smoke-filled version of New York City where a man in a red cape made a choice that, without his knowledge, began tearing at the seams of reality. Dr. Stephen Strange is not a humble man. He was a surgeon before he was a sorcerer, and surgeons, the best ones, the ones with the steadiest hands and the most lethal confidence, tend to understand the world through the lens of their own exceptional competence. Strange was exceptional. He knew it. The knowing was part of the problem, and also eventually part of the solution. Because it meant that when he found a way to do the impossible, he did not pause to interrogate whether the impossible should be done. He simply did it, with the same focused certainty that had once guided a scalpel through procedures that lesser hands would have refused to attempt. The 14,605. Strange reviewed every one of those timelines in the space of a single confrontation with Thanos, experienced each one's full sequence of events in enough detail to distinguish the one that led to survival from the 14,604 that did not. This is a feat of consciousness so extraordinary that the story glides past it almost immediately, because the plot needs to move and the implication would stop the film entirely if allowed to breathe. Strange reviewed 14 million deaths. 14 million complete sequences of events in which the Avengers failed, in which Thanos succeeded, in which 5 trillion lives were erased, and the universe went on without them. He held all of that. He held all of that. And then he looked at Tony Stark and raised one finger, signaling that there was one way, and he let the events proceed. The ethical weight of that moment is not something the MCU spends much time unpacking, because it doesn't need to. It is legible in Benedict Cumberbatch's face during the snap, in the specific way he stands in Titan's ruins watching Tony bleed out, in the quality of his stillness. He is not calm. He is contained. There is a difference. Calm is the absence of distress. Containment is the disciplined management of distress that is fully present and has been judged insufficient reason to change course. Strange in that moment is the most extreme version of a thing he's been becoming since Kamar-Taj. Someone who can hold the unbearable as a necessary condition of the possible. What this costs him is something the multiverse story begins to account for. No Way Home's Strange is a man who's been operating at this level of containment for years. Through the snap, through the 5 years of absence, through the unsnap and the battle and Tony's death, and the adjustment to a world that is 4% short of what it was, he is doing what he always does, which is functioning at an extremely high level with a very large amount of internal weight that he has learned to work around rather than through. The memory spell was not a careless choice. It was the choice of a person who has been carrying other people's costs for years and has developed the specific blind spot of the habitually capable. The assumption that if it is solvable, it should be solved, and that the solving is sufficient response to the problem. Kamar-Taj is, among other things, a school for the capacity to sit with what cannot be solved. The Ancient One's curriculum was not primarily about power. The power came as a consequence of the meditation, the breath work, the practice of existing in relationship to forces that do not answer to individual will. The core lesson was stillness. The core lesson was the specific discipline of remaining present to something overwhelming, without either fixing it or fleeing it. Strange passed his way through this school brilliantly, which means he learned the techniques without fully absorbing the underlying posture. He can do extraordinary things. He has not yet learned fully when not to do them. The multiverse opened because of him. This is not a condemnation. It is a description. It opened because he is a man of enormous capability and genuine care who has not yet found the integration between those two qualities that would allow him to serve without imposing. The care is real. The capability is real. The gap between them is the space in which unintended consequences live. Avengers. Endgame required a sacrifice he did not make. Tony Stark made that sacrifice. Strange watched it happen, having already seen the one timeline in 14 million where this outcome was possible, having guided every event toward that single moment with the patience of a man arranging dominoes over years. He watched Tony die and said nothing that would disrupt the sequence. That is the part of Strange that is extraordinary, and also the part that should give you pause here in the quiet. The capacity to hold the knowledge of someone's death and say nothing, because you have calculated that it is necessary. But Strange is not calculating in No Way Home. Strange in No Way Home is tired. Tired in the specific way that follows enormous loss. Peter Parker's secret identity has been revealed, and in trying to fix a problem that is real and painful and affecting someone he cares for, Strange attempts a spell, a memory erasure, a forgetting imposed on everyone who knows that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. The spell goes wrong. Not because Strange is inattentive. He isn't. Not because the magic is beyond him. It isn't. It goes wrong because Peter Parker cannot stop changing the parameters mid-cast. Each time Strange tries to anchor the spell, Peter says, "Wait, but not them." And the spell, which is responsive to intent the way water is responsive to the shape of its container, keeps reconfiguring, keeps reaching further. By the time Strange manages to contain it in the Machina di Cadavius, the spell is already looking outward, already searching for everyone who knows, and everyone who knows turns out to be a phrase with no natural border, because in a multiverse where knowledge persists across timelines, everyone includes people from places where the laws of physics are a suggestion, and the concept of containment is someone else's problem. Villains arrive, and then, worse, in a way that Strange did not initially recognize as worse, heroes arrive. Other Peter Parkers, other Spider-Men from other branches, other versions of the same kid wearing the same kind of loss and the same kind of grace, carrying their different tragedies in the same web-worn hands. Strange's role in this particular story is not to be the hero. Strange's role is to be the man who almost made a catastrophic mistake in the attempt to be helpful, and who then had to sit with the strange, the word deserves its lowercase here, position of being simultaneously responsible for the breach and uniquely capable of repairing it. The multiverse came open because of his spell, and closing it cost something. The final spell of No Way Home is not a small thing. Let it register in the weight of your body, in the quiet of where you're lying right now. Strange cast a spell that made the entire world forget Peter Parker. Not just his identity, Peter himself. Everyone who knew him, loved him, had been shaped by him, woke up the next morning with a smooth place in their memory where he used to be. Peter Parker, the one from this timeline, became a ghost in his own life. Sit with that. The price of the multiverse not tearing completely open was one young man's invisibility in his own world. That is the economy of the universe as Strange understands it. Every spell has a price. Every repair costs something. And Strange, who has spent years learning to calculate which costs are bearable and which are not, accepted this one without the kind of public anguish that would have made it easier to watch. He accepted it quietly, because the multiverse, once breached, does not close itself. Someone has to pay the toll, and on this occasion, the toll was paid by someone who wasn't even in the room when the deal was made. His arc in the multiverse saga is, at its core, the arc of a very good person learning the difference between helping and rescuing, learning that some problems are not his to solve, and that the act of reaching for them anyway, however skilled the reach, however good the intention, can produce its own damage. This spell that cost Peter Parker his identity was not a mistake. It was a lesson, and Strange received it the way he receives most lessons, completely, painfully, and with the particular dignity of someone who is not accustomed to needing to learn things twice. There is a scene in No Way Home that the story does not linger on, but that carries more weight than its duration suggests. Strange, alone in the mirror dimension, watching his spell unravel while Peter Parker swings through a fractured geometry of reality. Strange is trying to contain the damage. Peter is trying to expand the definition of who gets saved. They are both doing the things they have been built to do, and those things are directly incompatible, and neither of them is wrong. Strange understands the systemic risk. Peter understands the individual cost. Between those two kinds of understanding, the systemic and the individual, the multiverse opens. This tension is not unique to the MCU. It is one of the oldest moral fault lines in any tradition that has tried to think carefully about how to act, when the right thing for the whole and the right thing for the person are not the same thing. The trolley problem dressed in a red cape, standing in a mirror dimension, watching the mathematics of reality disaggregate because a teenager keeps changing the terms. Strange has learned to calculate these trade-offs at scales most minds cannot reach. He has learned to be steady in the face of individual costs borne for collective benefit. What he has not yet fully learned is how to hold space for the person who cannot make that calculation, who refuses to, not out of ignorance, but out of the specific moral insistence that the individual cannot simply be a variable in someone else's optimization. Peter Parker is, in the deepest sense, the character who embodies this refusal. His entire arc, across 3 films and a set of experiences that would have broken most people into forms of themselves they could not recognize, is organized around the conviction that the person in front of you matters at the same level of reality as any abstract principle about how to allocate harm. He cannot let the villains be sent back to their deaths without trying to save them first. Not because he is naive. Peter Parker is not naive, and by the end of No Way Home he is not even particularly innocent, but because he has decided that the person in front of him is real, in a way that the consequences in the other timeline are not. They are real. He knows they are real. He simply cannot make himself act as though they are more real than the person he can see. Strange eventually understands this about him. The final spell, the world forgetting Peter Parker, is not something Strange imposes without care. It is something he offers, and Peter chooses. That shift of agency, from the sorcerer managing the situation to the young man making the hardest decision of his life with his eyes open, is the thing that the story needs to happen, and that Strange, by the end of No Way Home, has learned enough to allow. He steps back. He lets Peter choose. That is, in the geography of Strange's arc, a significant distance travelled. There is something in Strange's arc that echoes a very old human pattern. The expert who knows the cost but lets someone else bear it. Not out of cruelty, out of the particular coldness that expertise can calcify into when it goes unchallenged long enough. Strange is not a villain. He is something more interesting and more uncomfortable than a villain. He is a man of enormous power who has learned to make the hardest choices and who has not yet fully reckoned with the difference between necessary hardness and ordinary avoidance. His own multiverse reckoning was coming. In the multiverse of madness it arrived. But we will get there. For now, feel the room around you. The dark is steady. Your body knows how to rest even when your mind is still turning slowly over the things we've said. Let it turn. Let the thoughts complete their arc and descend. You are safe. The night is patient, and there is more story left to tell. Breathe in, hold, and release into the dark, into the quiet, into whatever comes next. Let your breath find its own rhythm now. You don't need to guide it. The body knows, in and out, slow and even, like a tide that has been moving since long before you were born and will continue long after you've drifted into whatever rest awaits you tonight. Simply listen to it. Simply be inside it. There is a question the Marvel Cinematic Universe spent several years approaching from different angles without ever quite saying aloud until it was unavoidable. What happens when the most powerful being in any timeline is also the most grieving? Wanda Maximoff lost her parents to a Stark Industries shell casing when she was 10 years old. She lost her brother Pietro in Sokovia during a battle that should never have happened. She lost Vision twice, and in different ways, each loss calibrated by circumstance to be its own particular kind of unbearable. The first time, she destroyed the Mind Stone herself because it was the only way to stop Thanos, and she did it with his hand in hers and his voice telling her it was okay, and then Thanos reversed time and killed him again anyway, making her sacrifice not just painful but meaningless. The second time in the vision she built herself in Westview, she lost him slowly, over the course of weeks of constructed domesticity, and then lost him to her own decision, the decision to release the hex and let her imagined town breathe free air again. WandaVision is the story of what grief does when it is not permitted an outlet. Wanda arrived in Westview carrying a grief that had no language in the Avengers' operational culture, a grief that had been deferred by the literal pause of the snap, by the urgency of the restoration, by the battle, and then by Tony's death, which needed its own space that compressed Wanda's back further. She arrived in a quiet town with the deed to a house that Vision had planned for them before he died, and the house was empty, and the plans were blueprints rather than walls, and the town was ordinary, and she had the power to make it extraordinary, and no sufficient reason not to. The Hex is Wanda Maximoff doing what she has always done, using the chaos magic that runs through her as naturally as blood uses her veins, but in a context stripped of all the usual ethical checks. There was no enemy. There was no emergency. There was only the unbearable specific weight of an empty house in a quiet town, and the power to fill it. She filled it. She filled it with a sitcom logic that moved through the decades of television history, the way a person who grew up watching American television through a satellite signal might organize comfort, by genre, by era, by the specific aesthetic language of shows she had learned English from, shows that had taught her that this is what domestic happiness looks like, this is what a husband looks like when he loves you, this is how a kitchen is lit when everything is fine. Vision in the Hex is not precisely Vision. He is the part of Vision that Wanda's chaos magic could reconstitute from memory and love and need, which is a great deal, because her memory of him is comprehensive, and her love for him is one of the most powerful forces in any timeline. He's real enough to develop curiosity about why the edge of the town feels wrong, real enough to remember something that feels like values even without the continuous thread of his actual memory, real enough to love her back in the way that the reconstituted version of a person who loved you loves you, genuinely, without the irony of knowing what he is. The inhabitants of Westview suffered. This is not mitigated by Wanda's grief, and the show, to its credit, does not ask us to mitigate it. It holds both things simultaneously, the genuine unbearability of her loss, and the genuine suffering of the people whose autonomy she overrode in building her relief. Monica Rambeau, who enters the Hex and comes out changed, who understands from inside it that Wanda is not a villain but a person in impossible pain, is also clear-eyed about the cost. The two things coexist. The show does not collapse them into each other. The Scarlet Witch prophecy in the Darkhold predicts what Wanda becomes when the grief is not addressed but weaponized. When the Hex is dismantled and the reconstituted vision dissolves and Billy and Tommy are gone and the grief has nowhere left to put itself, the Darkhold offers a logical reframe. This grief is not evidence of your loss. It is evidence of your power. You have children. They exist. In the timelines where you made different choices or where different things happened to you, they are real, and they are alive, and they are calling you Mum. The grief is not something to be processed. It is a compass. It is pointing you at what you need, and you are powerful enough to take it. She kept the grief. This is important. Wanda Maximoff, who can reshape reality with the force of her intention, could not reshape the fact of her loss. What she could do, what the Darkhold whispered to her in the language of her own desire, was find a universe where the loss had not happened, a timeline branch where the version of herself who had made different choices still had what this Wanda had given up. The Darkhold is not a neutral text. It should be understood, here in the quiet, as something that functions less like a book and more like a mirror that only shows you what you most want and then explains, in perfectly reasonable and internally consistent language, exactly how to take it. Every page is a permission slip. Every chapter is a path through the darkest possible door with the most beautiful possible destination printed on the outside. The Scarlet Witch prophecy in its pages is not a warning. It is a recipe. And Wanda read it with the particular attention of someone who has decided that the cost no longer matters. Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness is a horror film in a way that very few superhero films allow themselves to be. Not because of the visual violence, though the violence is real, and Strange's direction renders it with a commitment that pulls no punches, but because of what it asks you to sit with, a woman in profound and genuine pain, doing profoundly terrible things and remaining comprehensible throughout. Wanda in that film is never cartoonish. She is never snarling. She moves through other realities with the focused, terrible efficiency of a parent who has decided that their child's well-being supersedes every other consideration. That framing, and the fact that we are made to understand it even as we watch her tear apart rooms full of people who are trying to stop her, is the film's most honest and most disturbing achievement. She wanted to dream walk, to slip into the mind of her variant self and live in that body, in that life, in the timeline where Billy and Tommy are real boys who call her Mum. She wanted it with the full force of her power. And because she is the Scarlet Witch, a being whose potential has been described in the ancient texts as the capacity to rewrite the laws of existence itself, what she wanted was extremely close to what she could have. The Illuminati in Earth 838 tried to stop her. They did not succeed. This is not a spoiler that diminishes what follows. It is a fact that the story uses as its turning point, because the failure of the most powerful group of heroes in an alternate universe to slow Wanda Maximoff down functions as the story's way of calibrating how serious this is. The scale of what she represents is not abstract. It is demonstrated. Sit with this. Take a slow breath. You don't have to hold the weight of it. Just let it pass through you, the way the story passes through these quiet hours. What stops her is not power. Strange, for all his abilities, does not defeat Wanda through superior force. What stops her is her sons. Billy and Tommy, the versions of them in Earth 838, who can feel her presence in their mother's body, who look at a face they know and see something in the eyes that frightens them. The fear in a child's eyes when they look at the person who loves them most and see something they cannot recognize. That image, in the visual language of the film, is the one thing that cuts through the Darkhold certainty. Not a spell, not a battle, a child who is afraid of his mother. This is how the Darkhold works. Not through corruption in the cartoon sense, not by turning good people evil through force, through reframing, through taking what is real and painful and true, and offering a logic that makes the destructive path feel not just justified, but necessary. Wanda did not become the Scarlet Witch because she was weak. She became the Scarlet Witch because she was in pain, and the Darkhold spoke fluently to that pain in a language that felt like compassion, and was actually something older and colder than compassion. Something that only pretends to care about the person it is speaking to, and actually cares only about what the person will do. The Scarlet Witch's power is not a gift in the conventional heroic sense. It is not a capability acquired through training or technology, or the kind of deliberate personal development that characterizes most of the MCU's heroes. It is something she was born with, something that Hydra's experimentation did not create but amplified, something that the Mind Stone catalyzed from potential into expression. It is, in the language of the ancient texts Strange reads in the Kamar-Taj library, a form of chaos magic, the rarest and most difficult of the magical disciplines precisely because it does not follow rules. Chaos magic does not work within the existing structure of reality. It rewrites the structure. It reaches into the fabric of what is and makes it what it needs to be. This is why Wanda is categorized differently from Strange by those who study such things. Strange is powerful, extraordinarily so, but his power operates within the framework of the mystic arts, a discipline with rules, with precedent, with techniques that can be taught and learned and practiced. His ability exceeds most practitioners, but it is fundamentally the same kind of ability, on a continuum with what Kamar-Taj teaches. Wanda's ability is not on that continuum. She is not a very talented sorcerer. She is something that the sorcerers study, the way scientists study a phenomenon rather than a practitioner. The Darkhold was written, in part, about her, not as a prophecy she was expected to fulfill, but as a documentation of what this kind of power looks like when it fully manifests. The Scarlet Witch is, in the Darkhold's framing, not a title. It is a species, a category of being that appears apparently at intervals across the multiverse, one per generation, perhaps one per universe. The particular combination of chaos magic potential and sufficient emotional investment in the world to give that magic a direction. Wanda is the current instantiation, and the Darkhold's description of what the Scarlet Witch can do, rewrite natural law, tear through dimensional barriers, access timelines beyond her own, is not a description of what she would need to learn to do. It is a description of what she already can. If the emotional stakes are high enough, the emotional stakes became high enough in Westview, and then became higher, and the Darkhold was there to explain that the height of the stakes was not a measure of how much she had lost, but of how much she was capable of taking back. That framing, loss as proof of power rather than evidence of limitation, is the specific seduction that the Darkhold offers. It is always available to anyone who is powerful and grieving. It is available to Strange in theory if he encounters a loss significant enough. It is available to anyone. The Darkhold does not create the desire, It finds the desire that is already present and tells it that it is allowed. Wanda Maximoff died, or appeared to die, or chose to die, or willed the mountain down on herself in an act that destroyed the Darkhold and all its corrupting architecture, and left behind a question that the MCU has not yet fully answered. What does the most powerful grief in any universe look like when it finds its way home? The Scarlet Witch prophecy in the Darkhold says she will take what she needs, but what Wanda needed, it turns out, was not what the Darkhold was offering. What she needed was to put down the book, and she did it in the most Wanda Maximoff way possible, by choosing the pain of her son's safety over the pleasure of her own relief. Your body is heavy and warm and still. The dark in this room is the same dark that has always been here, patient and familiar. Let the story settle. Let Wanda's choice settle. It is not a comfortable thing. It is the kind of love that costs everything and offers nothing in return except the knowledge that you paid it. And that is sometimes what love actually is. Rest now. We go deeper in a moment, but first, breathe. You are deeper now than when we began. Can you feel it? The quality of the dark has changed, thickened slightly, become more yours, more shaped to the particular quiet that belongs to you tonight. Your breathing is doing its own work. Your thoughts, if they are still moving, are moving more slowly now, like clouds at the end of the day rather than morning clouds racing for somewhere they need to be. You are here. You are only here. Of all the figures who move through the multiverse story, the two who carry the most human weight, paradoxically, are the ones who were never human to begin with. Loki Laufeyson, god of mischief, adopted Prince of Asgard, born frost giant and never quite at peace with the distance between what he was born as and what he was raised to be. He's a character who has spent his entire arc pretending to want power as a substitute for wanting love. Every scheme, every betrayal, every alliance made and broken and remade, looked at with sufficient patience, traces back to a boy who was told in the worst possible way that his origins made him something other than what he was allowed to be. That is not an excuse for anything he did. It is an explanation. And explanations matter in the multiverse, where every version of Loki got a different variation on the same wound. The TVA captured a specific Loki, the one who escaped with the Tesseract in the Endgame time heist, the variant who never had the years that the primary MCU Loki had to slowly, painfully, through enormous personal cost, become something approaching good. This Loki is raw. He is still in the early stage of the arc, still performing detachment, still organizing his face into the expression of a man who finds everything amusing and needs nothing. The void is the place the TVA sends things it prunes, a realm at the end of time, past the last moment of the sacred timeline, in the space beyond which nothing is supposed to exist, where everything that has been deleted accumulates, pruned timelines, pruned variants, objects and people and entire civilizations that were judged to be deviations, all of them deposited in the void the way an office disposes of paperwork it no longer needs but hasn't quite gotten around to destroying. The void is not nothing. It is the accumulated weight of everything that was not permitted to continue. Loki finds himself there after being pruned, and what he finds there, past the initial disorientation, past the very Loki response of trying to immediately assess the political landscape and identify who is most worth allying with, is a collection of other Lokis, variants of himself from other timelines, all of them pruned for various deviations, all of them making the characteristic Loki accommodation to impossible circumstances, surviving through wit and flexibility, and the particular advantage that a person who has always felt like an outsider has in environments where everyone is an outsider. Classic Loki is the most significant of them. An older variant, a Loki who survived his encounter with Thanos by casting an illusion so complete that even Thanos believed it, who then retreated to an uninhabited planet and lived alone for what appeared to be centuries thinking. The longest meditation in Loki variant history, an entire life spent in the absence of the things that had always defined him, the schemes, the performances, the elaborate architecture of persona built over the wound of his origins. And what he found in the silence of that planet, in the absence of an audience, was that he did not miss the schemes. He missed Asgard. He missed his brother. That is the revelation that classic Loki carries into the void and shares in his particular mode of sharing things, which involves sardonic distance maintained around genuine feeling like a shell maintained around a soft interior. The Loki's problem is not that they are villains, it is that they are the kind of beings who organize their lives around the performance of not needing the things they most need, and who then, when the performance runs long enough, confuse it with who they actually are. He Who Remains pruned him eventually when his solitary existence became a nexus event of its own kind, perhaps simply by existing too long, too quietly, too far from the narrative the sacred timeline had planned for him. His death in the void, the illusion of Asgard made real enough to hold back Aliath for long enough, is the moment that breaks something open in Loki. Classic Loki dies doing the thing the Loki archetype most consistently fails to do. He acts without the performance. He casts his greatest spell in full knowledge that it will kill him, with an audience, and he does not make it a gesture. He makes it a fact. He casts it because it needs to be cast, because Loki and Sylvie need to get through, and he is the only one who can make the path. He casts it laughing, which is the Loki way of doing the things that hurt most, and then he is gone. Loki carries this into his own final choice at the loom of time. The laughing is not present at the loom. Loki at the loom of time is very quiet, very still, as alone as classic Loki was on his planet, but without the centuries of solitude as preparation. He has had one season. He has had Mobius and Sylvie and B-15 and a handful of months of something that felt like belonging. And now he is choosing to put all of that down and pick up the one thing no one can share with him. The weight of every timeline. The vigil at the end of everything. He does it the way classic Loki did his final spell. Because it needs to be done, and he is the only one who can. Then he meets Mobius, and then, more importantly, he meets Sylvie. Sylvie is a Loki variant who was pruned by the TVA as a small girl for a Nexus event so minor the records don't specify what it was. She has spent her life running. Every apocalypse in history has been her hiding place. The fall of Pompeii, the destruction of Asgard, the last moments of dying planets. Because in an apocalypse there is no future to protect, and therefore no reason for the TVA to intervene. She has lived so long in endings that she has developed the particular kind of peace that comes from having nothing left to lose, except she is still Loki, still the same fundamental pattern underneath, intelligent beyond the comfortable range, lonely in the specific way that people are lonely, when they're too perceptive to accept the easy comfort and too experienced with loss to reach for the complicated kind. She reaches for Loki anyway. He reaches back. Not because it is wise, both of them are wise enough to know it isn't, but because there is a difference between knowing the smart thing and being capable of doing it, and when the person in front of you is the version of yourself that survived everything you didn't, The logic of caution collapses entirely. Their relationship, not quite love in the conventional sense, more like recognition pressed past every boundary recognition normally respects, is the emotional engine of Loki Season 1. Two people who are the same person, loving each other across the difference of everything that happened to them after the branching point of their respective timelines. It should be impossible to invest in. It should feel like a narrative trick. It does not feel like a trick. It feels like something true about the nature of connection, that what we love in another person is often the version of ourselves that made different choices, survived different losses, carried a different weight, and came through it with a different kind of grace. The choice Sylvie makes at the end of Season 1, pushing Loki through a time door and killing He Who Remains Alone, cutting the one relationship that had begun to feel like home in order to pursue the vengeance she had organized her entire life around, is the choice of someone who does not believe she deserves what she is giving up. That is what makes it devastating. Not the geopolitical implications of the sacred timeline fracturing, the expression on her face when she does it. Sit with that. In the quiet where you are lying, sit with the particular grief of the thing you pushed through the door because you didn't believe you were allowed to keep it. Loki Season 2 answers the question of whether Loki can become something other than what he has always been. The answer is yes. But the price is everything he spent Season 1 reaching for. He ends the season and the series standing at the loom of time at the end of all things, holding every timeline in his hands, having understood that the only way to preserve the branching multiverse without war or collapse is to become its anchor himself, alone, at the end of time, forever. He sits on the throne of He Who Remains, and he does not make it a throne. He makes it a vigil. That distinction is everything. He Who Remains sat there in fear of what he had unleashed and pruned it back to nothing. Loki sits there in love of what he is permitted to grow and holds it open. The same chair, the same burden, a completely different posture toward what it means. Time-slipping is the mechanism that Loki Season 2 introduces as its central mystery and its deepest metaphor. Loki finds himself pulled involuntarily through different moments in his own timeline, backwards and forwards, without control, without warning, a consciousness skipping through time the way a stone skips across water, touching each moment briefly before being flung to another. He is present in his own past. He is present in his own future. He experiences both as equally real, equally present, equally now. The disorientation this produces is not just narrative, it is philosophical. If you have been in your own future, then the future is not simply a direction, it is a place. It exists, fully formed, whether or not you have reached it yet through the normal sequential progress of moments. The choices you have not yet made have already been made somewhere ahead on the timeline, and the consequences of those choices are already unfolding. This does not resolve the question of whether those choices were free, it simply relocates the question. The freedom, if it exists, was exercised somewhere you have already been without knowing it. Loki time slips and tries to master the skill because that is what he does. He takes the thing that is happening to him against his will and tries to turn it into an instrument. He finds Ouroboros, OB, the TVA's resident technical genius, a man who has spent an indeterminate period in the repairs and advancements department, and has the specific quality of mind that finds everything interesting, and together they begin working on the problem. Loki will learn to control the slipping. The slipping will become a tool. The tool will be used to change something that needs changing. What he eventually understands through the specific education that can only be delivered by experiencing the same failure enough times to see the pattern, is that the time slipping is not a malfunction. It is preparation. His consciousness is being expanded to contain multiple moments simultaneously, is being trained through repeated exposure to exist in more than one point in time at once. This is not the kind of skill you can teach in a Kamar-Taj classroom. It is the kind that is burned into you by necessity, by the specific pressure of being the person who is needed for a task that requires exactly this capacity and having no other option but to develop it. The loom of time is the moment toward which the time slipping was always pointing. The device that holds the sacred timeline in place, that takes the branching timelines and compresses them back toward the single strand, is the thing that must be destroyed if the branches are to be allowed to grow freely. And destroying it means someone standing in the place where it explodes. Loki stands there. He has been to this moment before in the time slipping, and each time he arrived there he could not survive what came next, until he had practiced enough, until the expansion of his consciousness was sufficient to contain not just this moment and the one before it, but all of them, until he could hold the full weight of all the timelines simultaneously, rather than being torn apart by them. He does it. He holds them. This is the thing about Loki's final act that is most important and most easily overlooked. It is not a sacrifice in the conventional sense. A sacrifice involves giving up something to gain something else, trading one value for a higher one. What Loki does at the loom of time is not a trade, it is a becoming. He does not give up his life, he gives up his smallness. He expands into the full scope of what the time slipping was preparing him for, a being large enough to hold infinity, present enough to hold it without crushing it, patient enough to hold it for as long as it needs to be held. The god of mischief became the god of stories. Every branching timeline is a story he is holding. Every variant and every Sylvie running through every apocalypse, every Wanda in every universe, every strange staring at the 14,605 possibilities, is a narrative he has chosen to protect rather than prune. This is, in the end, what the fight for timeline control was always really about. Not control. The word was always wrong. It was about the question underneath the control. Whose story gets to be told? And the answer, when it finally comes, is not one that any bureaucracy could have reached. The answer is all of them. Everyone. The variants and the deviants and the divergents and the ones who chose differently at the moment when the timeline forked. All of them. Every branch. Every world. Every quiet room where someone is breathing slowly into the dark and telling themselves a story about who they are. Breathe now. You're very nearly there. The night is carrying you. Let it. Somewhere between wakefulness and sleep there is a corridor. You may have noticed it. A brief stretch where the thoughts become less insistent, where the edges of things soften just slightly, where the body has already made its decision even though the mind is still composing its argument. You are in that corridor now. Do not rush it. The other side will receive you when it is ready. For now, simply walk. When Sylvie drove her blade into He Who Remains and the sacred timeline fractured, when the river delta was suddenly free to branch again after centuries of enforced singularity, what was released was not chaos in the simple destructive sense. It was something more specific and more dangerous. It was the population of Kangs. Kang the Conqueror is not a man. He is a category, a type, a specific configuration of genius, ambition, and the particular moral flexibility that the 31st century produces in certain exceptional individuals who discover that time travel is possible and begin immediately calculating what this means for them personally. Across the multiverse, the configuration appears again and again, slightly different each time, shaped by the different pressures of different timelines, but recognizably the same pattern beneath the variation. The same brilliant face wearing the same fundamental hunger with different justifications. The quantum realm is one of the MCU's most interesting pieces of conceptual architecture because it operates according to physics that are neither the physics of the macro world nor the physics of the sacred timeline, but something older and stranger and less governed. Scott Lang's first entry into it was accidental, a test of the Pym particle suit that went further than intended, a free fall through scales of reality that should have killed him and instead showed him a world where time moved differently, where the geometry of space was negotiable, where the very small became as vast as the very large. He didn't understand what he was seeing. He did not need to. He needed only to survive it, and he did. The quantum realm's role in the Avengers' time travel mechanic, the time heist, was functional, a conduit, a back door into the timeline's plumbing, used to retrieve the Infinity Stones from moments before Thanos gathered them. Scott Lang was essential to this not because of his intelligence or his power, but because he was the one who had survived the quantum realm and come back, and because his particular gift is the ability to not fully grasp the danger he is in until after it has passed, which turns out to be a meaningful advantage when the danger in question is the complete unraveling of causality. Kang built his empire in this realm because it was, in his timeline's terms, unclaimed, ungoverned. A space between the laws of physics where a sufficiently advanced intelligence could establish its own order. He arrived there as an exile and did what Kangs do. He surveyed the territory, calculated its resources, identified the population's weaknesses and its strengths, and began building. The civilization he created in the quantum realm is not merely a military occupation. It is a genuine construction. Architecture, governance, technology, a society organized around his particular vision of what order should look like. This is what distinguishes Kang from a simple conqueror. He doesn't just take, he builds on what he takes. He creates something that functions. The tragedy of his particular variant is that the thing he created functions through subjugation, and the thing he subjugated was people who had their own vision of what their world should look like. Kang's specific genius in the quantum realm scenes is his patience. He is not in a hurry. He has been in the quantum realm for a long time, long enough to conquer it, long enough to build his tower and his city, long enough to understand the realm's mechanics more completely than any being who arrived there before him. He offers Scott a deal with the demeanor of a man who has already run the probability calculations and knows how the deal ends. He is right about almost everything. He is wrong about Scott Lang specifically, about the way that Scott's love for his daughter functions not as a vulnerability to be exploited, but as a resource that doesn't respond to the kind of logic Kang deploys. Love of this particular kind, the ordinary, stubborn, slightly ridiculous love of a parent for a child, completely uncalibrated to the magnitude of the circumstances, is not something Kang's calculations have adequately weighted. The Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania. Kang is not he who remains. He is not the tired, self-aware, apple-eating figure who wanted someone to stop him. He is an exile. He was banished to the quantum realm by his variants, pushed to the margins of the multiverse, because even the other Kangs found him too dangerous, which is a sentence that requires a moment to appreciate the full weight of. There is a council of Kangs, a gathering of the most powerful beings in any timeline, each of them a conqueror of worlds and centuries, and they looked at one of themselves and collectively decided, not him. He is too much. The Kang we meet in the quantum realm has been exiled and has, in that exile, done the thing that Kangs do, built. He conquered the quantum realm. He built a civilization in the subatomic. He created Kang in miniature, a pocket empire sustained by technology that the Avengers above him could not comprehend, and that the inhabitants of the quantum realm, Cassie Lang's brief revolution, the survivors of his initial conquest, paid for in the currency of their freedom. Scott Lang defeats him. This is important, and also the detail that Kang himself could not contain his contempt for, not because Scott is not clever or brave or genuinely willing to sacrifice everything for his daughter, but because Scott Lang is fundamentally an ordinary man, a good man, an optimistic man who believes in the capacity of people to help each other, even in circumstances that do not rationally support optimism. He defeats Kang not through superior intellect. Kang is the smartest man in the room in virtually every room he has ever entered, but through the specific advantage that goodness has over genius. It does not calculate, it just acts. But here is the thing about killing a Kang. Here is the thing that the story's final scene. That vast chamber, thousands of Kangs gathered in their purple and blue armor, addressing each other in the language of unified purpose, makes unavoidable. Killing a Kang is an announcement. It is a flare fired into the multiverse sky. It is proof that the sacred timeline is fractured, that the protection He Who Remains maintained has ended, and that the Nexus events are propagating outward into every branch simultaneously. The Council of Kangs, the gathering of variants who themselves pruned and contained their most extreme brother, has been watching. They have been waiting for this moment, not with the specific impatience of someone who resents the wait, but with the measured patience of people who understand timelines, who know because they have seen it in the probability calculations, that eventually the sacred timeline would fracture, that eventually He Who Remains would find his Sylvie, that eventually the branches would grow back. Sit with this. The room is very still. Your body is enormously heavy and quiet. Sit with the image of thousands of Kangs, all different and all the same, all gathering toward a single purpose in a chamber that should not exist. The Kang problem is not a villain problem in the traditional sense. You cannot assemble a team of heroes and defeat a Kang the way you assemble Avengers to stop Thanos. Thanos was one being with one plan and one timeline. Kang is a species. Kang is an archetype. Kang is what happens when a particular kind of intelligence, uncontained by adequate ethical development, discovers the tools to act across the full breadth of time and reality. There is no snap that erases them. There is no single battle that ends the war, because the war is already happening in 100 timelines simultaneously, and winning in one does not diminish the losses accumulating in the others. This is the inheritance of the post-sacred timeline multiverse. This is the world that Sylvie's blade and He Who Remains' quiet permission created. A world in which the greatest threat is not a single apocalyptic event, but a diffuse, permanent, multiversal pressure, Kang variants propagating across branches, each one building toward conquest, each one armed with century-level technology and millennium-level patience. Cassie Lang is the other variable Kang underweights. She is her father's daughter in the specific way that matters, not in the capability she has inherited, which is its own kind of formidable, but in the quality of the commitment. She came to the quantum realm to help people she had never met because she believed it was the right thing to do. That is not a calculation. It is a posture toward the world. And postures are much harder to defeat than plans, because you cannot outmaneuver something that does not have a specific path you can predict. The Council of Kangs watching from their gathered chamber are the story's reminder that defeating one Kang is not the same as solving the Kang problem. Each Kang defeated is a proof of concept, proof that the sacred timeline is fractured, proof that the branches are growing back, proof that the infinite is returning to replace the curated singular. They watch with the interest of beings who have been waiting for this proof, and what they do with it will define the next phase of a conflict that, as of now, the heroes of the MCU do not fully know they are already in. The language the Kangs speak to each other in that gathered chamber is not something the film translates, and it does not need to. The posture of it is clear enough. Thousands of variants of the same extraordinary mind, unified by a shared threat assessment, moving toward a coordinated response with the efficiency that only comes from identical underlying intelligence. They do not need to debate. They do not need to persuade each other. They have all reached the same conclusions through the same routes. The terrifying thing about a gathering of Kangs is not the individual power of each one, it is the consensus, the fact that they all agree. The heroes of the MCU were built for a different kind of threat. Iron Man's suits, Captain America's shield, Thor's hammer. These are tools for a universe in which the enemy has a location, a timeline, a point at which sufficient force can be decisive. Against the Kang Dynasty, they are the wrong tools for the problem. What is needed is something the Marvel Cinematic Universe has not yet fully shown us, a way of thinking about heroism that can function across the full width of the infinite. We are, in the timeline we currently occupy as viewers and listeners, still waiting to understand what that looks like. The fight is not over. The fight, in a very real sense, has not yet truly begun. Rest in that, not in dread. Rest, gently, in the openness of a story that has not yet resolved. There is something peaceful in the unfinished, something that allows the imagination to breathe. The question hangs in the dark like a lantern not yet lit. Who will answer the Kang Dynasty, and what will they have to become in order to do it? We will continue, slowly, in a moment. For now, breathe. The night is long, and we are moving through it together. You have come so far tonight. Feel it. The distance between the person who first lay down and the person who is here now, in this particular depth of quiet. You are not the same as you were an hour ago. Something has been set down. Something that was held is now resting on the floor beside you, no longer requiring your grip. That is what this kind of darkness does. If you let it, it receives what you release, a nexus event. The TVA's term for it, their bureaucratic orange folder language for one of the most philosophically extraordinary concepts in all of the multiverse lore, is a deviation, a point at which the timeline branches from the sacred strand in a way significant enough to register on their instruments, significant enough to send a hunter team through a time door to investigate and contain. But what is it actually at the level of lived experience? What does it feel like from inside the moment that cracks a timeline open? It feels almost certainly like a decision, a choice made in a specific emotional state that would have been made differently on a different day or in a different frame of mind. It feels like the morning you didn't call, or the door you walked through instead of past, or the word you said in the exact tone that changed everything between two people in a way that could not be precisely undone. From inside the moment, a Nexus event feels like a Tuesday. It feels like the specific Tuesday on which the unremarkable became permanent. Mobius Mobius is the character in Loki who carries the TVA's moral weight most clearly, because he is the character who is most genuinely committed to the institution before learning the truth about it. He believes in what the TVA does. He has spent what feels like a career, though in truth he has no continuous memory, and therefore no actual career, only the impression of one, carefully maintained by a reset device, and the absence of any record of a life before, believing that the TVA's mission is just, that the pruning of Nexus events serves a real and important purpose, that the alternative to the sacred timeline is the chaos of a multiversal war, and that this is a sufficient reason for the things the TVA does. His relationship with Loki is the story's most honest portrait of what it looks like when two people with different epistemological starting points find their way to genuine mutual regard. Mobius is not impressed by Loki's grandeur. He has processed the lives of too many variants to be impressed by claims to greatness. He has seen Loki's file, which is extensive, and what it tells him is not that this is a powerful being deserving of deference, but that this is a frightened person performing power with extreme commitment. He meets the performance with the specific patience of a bureaucrat who has seen every kind of person and has developed the capacity to look past the presentation to the person underneath. Loki, who has spent his entire life meeting people who either feared him, wanted to use him, or loved him in ways complicated by the political circumstances of Asgard, does not know what to do with someone who does none of these things, who simply sits across a desk and asks him questions and listens to the answers with genuine attention. The disorientation this produces in Loki is the first crack in the performance. It is almost impossible to maintain a persona against someone who is simply not responding to the persona. The revelation that Mobius is a variant, that he was taken from a life he no longer remembers, that his sense of himself as a TVA agent is itself a construction imposed on him by the institution he believes in, hits him with the specific force of a thing that reframes not just the past, but the entire architecture of meaning built on that past. He has not been protecting the sacred timeline because he chose to. He has been protecting it because his memory was pruned to the point at which protecting it was the only version of himself he had access to. This is not a small thing. This is the complete structure of his selfhood revealed as a managed condition. What makes a Nexus event significant enough for TVA intervention is a question that has a bureaucratic answer and a deeper answer that the show spends its runtime slowly uncovering. The bureaucratic answer is, it registers on the time flow monitors. The branching becomes detectable. The deviation from the sacred strand exceeds some threshold value that a variant named Renslayer enforces without ever having been given a full explanation of why the threshold is where it is. The deeper answer is more interesting. The deeper answer, the one that Loki and Mobius inch toward through multiple conversations in break rooms and holding cells and apocalypses, is that a Nexus event is significant because it produces a variant whose existence, if permitted to continue, would change the outcome of events at the level of the entire timeline. The TVA does not prune choices. It prunes consequences. It prunes the specific persons whose lives, if allowed to unfold freely, would set the branching off in directions that destabilize the sacred strand's coherence. Which means, and follow this slowly because it moves quickly past its implications if you let it, which means the TVA was never really a time police force. It was an existence police force. It was a bureaucracy designed not to manage events but to manage people, to decide in advance and without appeal which people were too significant to be allowed. Sylvie's Nexus event was caused by something so minor that the file does not specify what it was. A small girl, a variant of a character who would grow up to be the god of mischief. She deviated from the sacred strand for some small, invisible reason, perhaps the choice of a game, the direction of a look, the way a 4-year-old responds to the smell of something cooking in the next room, and the TVA sent hunters for her. Sit with this. Hold it against the warmth of the room, against the quality of the dark that has gathered here while we've been talking. A small girl, hunted not for what she did, but for what she was, for what her existence implied about the direction of a timeline. The TVA's judgment was that she was too much, that the world she might have made was not the world He Who Remains has chosen. What the Nexus event mythology forces the narrative to confront is the question of determinism. If every deviation is mapped, if every Nexus event is anticipated by a being with sufficient foreknowledge of timeline probabilities, then the sacred timeline is not fate in the sense of something that simply is. It is fate in the sense of something that has been enforced. There is no natural order to which the TVA is restoring the universe. There is only the order that one man preferred, maintained by violence, maintained by deletion. This is why Sylvie's vengeance is not simply understandable. It is, within the moral universe of the show, the only rational response available to someone who understands the full picture. She did not choose to be a Nexus event. She did not choose to be hunted. She did not choose to live in apocalypses, to run perpetually, to build her competence out of desperation and her warmth out of the specific alchemy of someone who should have become cold and somehow didn't. The sacred timeline made her a refugee, and she walked to the end of time to ask for the reckoning she was owed. The Nexus event as a concept is also quietly the show's argument about free will. Every time a timeline is pruned, a question is killed. The question of what that timeline might have been. Every variant deleted is a story never told. The TVA's operating philosophy is that some stories are too dangerous to tell, that the narrative of the multiverse must be managed the way a careful editor manages a book, cutting the passages that lead somewhere the author does not want to go. And yet, when Mobius gets his memories back, when he briefly touches his own original life, the life of a jet ski salesman, a life so ordinary and so specific and so completely his own, what he chooses to do is return. Not because the TVA is worth returning to, but because the people in it are. Because Loki and B-15 and Hunter X5 and all the other variants moving through that building in orange vests are people he has genuinely come to care about in the only way available to someone with his kind of constructed memory. By choosing care as a practice rather than a feeling, by committing to it daily rather than depending on the continuity of feeling to sustain it. This is, quietly, the Loki saga's argument about identity. The self is not the memory, the self is the choosing. Mobius without his memories is still Mobius because he keeps making the Mobius choices. The curiosity, the patience, the willingness to give people more credit than their files suggest they've earned. The variants in the TVA were taken from their lives, but they were not taken from their natures, and their natures keep expressing themselves even in the absence of any continuous thread of self-knowledge, which means that what the TVA tried to manage and contain, individual natures, individual ways of being in the world, is exactly the thing that proves most resistant to management. The very thing the sacred timeline tried to prune kept growing back, inside the institution built to do the pruning, Ravonna Renslayer believed. This is important, and the show does not diminish it. She believed in the TVA's mission with the specific certainty of someone who has organized her entire identity around an institution and cannot afford to question the institution's foundations because the foundations are also the foundations of herself. She enforced the pruning with the conviction of someone who has been given a reason and found it sufficient. The tragedy of her character is not that she was wrong. She was wrong. But that being wrong was not information she had the architecture to receive. The self she would have had to dismantle to receive it was the only self she had. But Loki, in the end, becomes something other than an editor. He becomes the space in which the unedited drafts are permitted to exist. He becomes the condition that makes all the Nexus events irrelevant as threats, because the branches they create are no longer pruned. They grow. They go where they go. And whatever they become, whatever variants they produce, whatever small girls choose, whatever small things in whatever quiet moments, those lives are allowed their full unfolding. The Nexus event in the light of what Loki becomes is no longer a problem. It is what it always should have been. The universe doing what it does when consciousness makes choices. The universe branching. The universe continuing. Your breath continues. In and out. The universe branching inside you with every heartbeat. You're a Nexus event in miniature. Every decision you have made has brought you to this precise moment, this room, this particular quality of rest. And here you are, allowed, undeleted, exactly as complex as you need to be. Good. Rest now. We're moving into the final turn of the story. The dark around you has a texture now, soft, close, the kind of dark that does not feel empty but full of the quiet weight of night, of air that has been breathed and warmed, of the small sounds the world makes when it thinks no one is listening. You are in it completely. Let the story continue. On Earth 838, there's a building that looks like a government structure, but functions as something closer to a confession. 6 chairs in a formal arrangement. 6 individuals who have collectively decided that the fate of their universe, and perhaps of others, is a problem that requires private management. The Illuminati. Reed Richards, Black Bolt, Maria Rambeau as Captain Marvel, Captain Carter, Charles Xavier in his moving chair, and the Mordo who in their universe became Sorcerer Supreme. 6 people who believe, with varying degrees of self-awareness about the belief, that they know better. The Marvel Illuminati concept has a comic book origin that the film both honours and quietly interrogates. A group of the most powerful and most intelligent heroes meeting in secret to make the decisions that cannot be made in public. The logic is comprehensible. There are situations in which a vote is not possible. There are emergencies that require someone to act before the deliberative process can reach a conclusion. There are terrible options, and the Illuminati is, in theory, the body capable of choosing between them without being paralyzed by the weight of the choosing. In practice, and this is what the film is actually about beneath the horror sequences and the multiversal spectacle, in practice, the Illuminati is what happens when intelligence, unchecked by humility, calcifies into exactly the kind of certainty it was designed to prevent. Reed Richards of Earth 838 is not a villain. He is a man of extraordinary intellect and good intentions, who has convinced himself, through a long sequence of individually defensible decisions, that his judgment is reliable enough to be trusted with absolute choices. It is a seduction that the most capable minds are most vulnerable to, because the evidence supporting the conclusion is so persuasive. They have been right so many times. The calculation has worked. The terrible option has indeed proven less terrible than the alternatives. Reed Richards of Earth 838 is a fascinating figure precisely because he is fully comprehensible. There is nothing cartoonish about his failure. No moment of obvious moral weakness. No temptation he succumbs to that we can clearly identify as the wrong choice. His failure is the failure of a good man operating at the limit of a framework that is insufficient for the situation he is in. His intelligence is real. His care for his family and his universe is real. His commitment to protecting Earth 838 from multiversal threats is real. And all of these real things, organized into the institutional structure of the Illuminati, produce an outcome that is catastrophic. The Illuminati's fundamental design flaw is that it has no mechanism for checking itself. A council that meets in secret, that makes decisions without external accountability, that operates on the premise that its own judgment is sufficiently reliable to be trusted with final authority. This structure has no feedback loop. There is no way for the council to receive information that its judgment is wrong, because the only people positioned to provide that information are the members themselves, and each member's judgment is the thing that is being questioned. An institution that cannot question itself cannot learn. An institution that cannot learn cannot adapt. An institution that cannot adapt is eventually destroyed by exactly the situation it was built to handle, because situations are not static, and the institution is. Black Bolt's confidence in his power is the clearest version of the Illuminati's failure in miniature. He has a power that is genuinely extraordinary, the mutagenic voice, the capacity to level mountains with a word, and he has lived his entire life maintaining the specific discipline required by that power: silence, constant, vigilant, costly silence, the self-control required to never accidentally destroy what he loves. He has mastered this, and the mastery has produced over decades a certainty that his power is adequate, that it is sufficient to the worst situations he will encounter, that the thing he has spent his life making safe is the thing that will save him when saving is required. Wanda asks him what happens when he can't speak. It is the question that dissolves his certainty completely, and completely without drama. There is no elaborate countermeasure, no moment where he almost overcomes her. She simply removes the possibility that his power is relevant, and what remains is a man who has organized his entire sense of safety around a capacity that is now unavailable to him. That is all. That is enough. They killed their universe's Strange. They decided, collectively in that room, after deliberation, that Dr. Strange of Earth 838 had become an incursion risk, that his dreamwalking, his multiverse manipulations, his use of the Darkhold had branded him too corrupting an influence on the timeline to be allowed to continue, and so they killed him. With what appeared to be clear consciences, or at least consciences that had learned to read clarity as the byproduct of having been right often enough. The incursion is the concept that connects the Illuminati's choices to the multiverse's deepest mechanic. When a being moves through timelines in the wrong way, or uses the Darkhold's corrupting power excessively, they damage the membrane between universes. Two realities begin to overlap. When they finally collide, one or both of them are destroyed. The incursion is what the sacred timeline was also designed to prevent, not by protecting individual timelines, but by ensuring that only one existed, and therefore nothing could collide with it. The Illuminati's certainty about Strange was not wrong as a prediction. Their Strange had indeed caused an incursion in his universe, but the method of their response, execution without trial, certainty without appeal, the final option chosen first rather than last, is the thing that made them capable of sitting in a room and watching Wanda Maximoff kill them without any of them making the adjustment in time. They were very good at making decisions. They were not good at recognizing when they were wrong. Wanda gets through them. This matters beyond the spectacle. She gets through them because each member of the Illuminati has organized their response around their individual certainty. Black Bolt is certain his voice is sufficient. Captain Marvel is certain she is strong enough. Reed Richards is certain he can find the solution in time. They are individually confident in ways that make them collectively brittle, because confidence without the capacity to be surprised by the other person, without genuine openness to the fact that this might be the moment the calculation fails, is simply a more elegant version of inflexibility. Sit with this quietly. The room is very still. Charles Xavier gets the furthest. He enters Wanda's mind, the thing he is trained for, the place where he has always been most capable, and for a moment he reaches her. He finds Wanda inside the Scarlet Witch. He finds the woman underneath the grief, underneath the Darkhold's corruption, and he speaks to her, and she responds. There is a flicker. There is a moment where the outcome is genuinely uncertain, where love is closer to the surface than calculation, where you can see that the person Wanda was is still there and is still listening, and then the Scarlet Witch closes over her and he dies. Not because he was wrong, he was right, she was there, that moment was real, but because he was alone in the effort. Because the Illuminati, for all their collective intelligence, did not have a plan for what to do when their most powerful member found something other than an enemy and needed backup in nurturing it. They were built for opposition, not for care, and care was the only tool that had any purchase. This is the thing the multiverse keeps demonstrating, in different registers and through different characters. The instruments of control are inadequate to the complexity of what they are trying to control. The TVA's time hunters, the Illuminati's executive committee, he who remains Citadel. They are all, in their different ways, attempts to reduce the wild and branching nature of reality to something manageable. And the multiverse keeps refusing to be managed, because management is not what it needs. Captain Carter's failure is different. She's a warrior, the kind who has built her competence through genuine difficulty, through earning everything she has through the specific combination of physical training and moral commitment that Steve Rogers embodied, and that this alternate version of his story attached to Peggy instead. She is not overconfident in the abstract. She is confident in the specific, in her shield, in her training, in the principles she has articulated to herself so clearly and held to so consistently that they feel like the bedrock of everything. When the bedrock turns out to be insufficient against something that doesn't negotiate with principles, she doesn't have time to find a different posture. She has time only to be surprised. What the Illuminati collectively lacked was not power. It was imagination, the specific kind of imagination that allows a mind to genuinely model the possibility of its own failure. To run the scenario in which the thing they trust most turns out to be the wrong tool. Not as an intellectual exercise, but as a felt preparation. The willingness to be genuinely uncertain in the body rather than merely in theory about whether this will work. That felt uncertainty is the thing that keeps the reflexes flexible. Without it, even the most extraordinary capabilities become brittle. Mordo of Earth 838 became Sorcerer Supreme because his timeline strange caused an incursion. He inherited the position from a man whose greatest failure was his greatest gift transfigured by excess, and he has spent however many years since developing the specific posture of someone who believes in safety above all other values, because he has seen, in the most direct possible way, what happens when someone sufficiently powerful decides that the rules do not apply to them. He is not wrong about what he has seen. He is wrong about what it means. Not all power used outside the rules causes incursions. The rules themselves were never perfectly calibrated to the difference. What it needs, the story argues in its patient and sometimes brutal way, is someone willing to hold it without trying to prune it. Someone who can sit with the impossible weight of infinite possibility and say, all of this gets to exist. All of this gets to become whatever it becomes. I will not choose for you which branch survives. The Illuminati could not do this. Their greatest gift was their certainty, and their certainty was also their most profound limitation. They knew too much and asked too little. In the quiet of this room, in the drift of your breathing, notice whether there is something you hold with too much certainty tonight. Some conclusion you have reached about how a thing will go, or who a person is, or what you deserve. Notice it without needing to solve it. Just let it soften slightly in the dark, and continue breathing. We're nearly at the end of what this night has to offer. The final movement is close. You are very deep now. The voice, if you're still hearing it, is coming from further away. Not because it has moved, but because you have. The part of you that listens to words is still here, still following. But another part has already gone ahead into the deep water, where words become feeling, and feeling becomes the simple animal warmth of a body at rest. That part is fine. Let it lead. The words will follow. Two universes approaching each other. Picture it not as a collision, not as two solid objects meeting with force, but as two soap bubbles drifting across the same surface, each full of their own particular light, each containing everything they contain, all the lives and choices and buildings and coastlines and conversations happening simultaneously in each respective reality. Now imagine them touching, just at the edge, just where the membranes are thinnest. An incursion begins at the boundary. It begins as a kind of leak. The physics of one universe begin to express themselves in the space of another. Laws that are not native to this reality seeping in at the margins, creating effects that cannot be explained by the standard model of this particular branch. Anomalies, impossibilities, things that should not exist appearing in the space between where they belong. In the comic mythology that the MCU is drawing from, incursions were one of the central catastrophes of the multiversal saga, the mechanism by which realities were destroyed wholesale, by which entire populated universes simply ceased to be because two branches had drifted too close. The Secret Wars event, which names from the comics appear to be leading the MCU toward, involves the complete collapse of the multiverse into a single battle world, where the remnants of many realities compete for the right to survive. The America Chavez is the piece of the multiverse puzzle that the story introduces with the specific care reserved for things that will eventually become central, quietly, in a context that seems at first to be supporting character material, with a power that is presented as straightforwardly extraordinary before the full complexity of its implications become clear. She can punch holes between universes. Not metaphorically. She encounters a situation of sufficient emotional intensity, and her fist goes through the air and the air opens, and on the other side is somewhere else entirely. Another branch, another reality. The same world run through a different set of choices until it looks different enough to be disorienting. She cannot control it. This is the crucial detail. America Chavez's power is the most direct form of multiversal travel available to any being in the MCU, more immediate than Stranger's spells, more precise than the Tempads, more raw than the quantum realm's time vortices, and she cannot direct it. It goes where the emotional intensity sends it, which means that the most powerful natural multiversal traveler in any timeline is a young woman running from something, propelled by the force of experiences she has not yet been given the space to process. Wanda wanted her power for this reason. the ability to punch through to a specific timeline, to the branch where Billy and Tommy exist, where the version of herself she wanted to become had the life this version was denied, is the thing the Darkhold could not fully provide through dreamwalking alone. Dreamwalking puts your mind in another body. It does not move you. America's power could move her, could plant her in the life she was reaching for with enough physical reality that the reaching might finally be enough. Strange protects America through the film with the specific energy of someone who has decided that the protection is his to provide and has not yet fully asked whether the person being protected has been given adequate agency in the arrangement. This is not malicious. It is the characteristic failure mode of the capable protector, the assumption that protection and care are the same thing, and that the person who needs protection also needs their choices made for them until the crisis is resolved. America is not passive. She resists this, in the way that teenagers in impossible situations resist adults who are simultaneously their only protection and their most immediate source of constraint. But she also genuinely needs help, and the tension between needing help and needing autonomy is one that the story holds without fully resolving. Her power being unlocked, her ability to finally choose where she goes rather than being thrown by emotional necessity, is the film's most understated triumph. Not the defeat of Wanda, not the destruction of the Darkhold. The moment when America Chavez, who has spent her entire life being pushed through universes by forces she could not control, stands still and chooses, steps through a door she has made, into a world she has picked as an act of will rather than an act of flight. That is the multiverse being used not as a threat or a weapon or a mechanism of escape, but as what it actually is: possibility, the structure of the optional, the architecture of choice made real. The multiverse held in this light is not frightening. It is the space that makes genuine choice possible in the most literal sense, not just the choice between the options immediately visible, but the choice between the versions of life that unfold from those options, the full branching tree of consequence extending from each decision into the future. America Chavez is the character who eventually embodies the multiverse's positive potential most fully. Not a controller, not a pruner, not a protector in the paternalistic sense, but a traveller. Someone who moves through the branches with agency and intention, and the specific confidence that comes not from knowing where she will end up, but from trusting herself to navigate wherever she arrives. What causes incursions in the MCU's specific mythology is still being clarified, but the most consistent explanation involves dreamwalking, the practice of projecting your consciousness into the body of your variant in another timeline. The Darkhold facilitates this. He who remains warned against it. The Earth 838 Illuminati killed their Doctor Strange partly because his dreamwalking had already caused one. Wanda Maximoff's extensive use of the same technique across the events of Multiverse of Madness was why Strange, dreaming in Strange's decaying body at the end of the film, found a third eye opening in his forehead, the physical mark of incursion damage accumulating in a being that has passed too many times through the wrong doors. The third eye is a small detail that the film treats with great seriousness. It is not a power. It is a symptom. It is the universe's way of marking someone who has bent the rules of reality sufficiently to leave a permanent trace on themselves. Strange accepts it with the specific equanimity of someone who has already processed the terror and arrived somewhere past it, not unbothered, but not overwhelmed, aware, carrying it forward. The incursion mechanic changes the ethical stakes of multiverse exploration in a way that the characters in this universe are still learning to calculate. The question is no longer simply, is this possible? The question is, what does doing this cost and who pays, and are they given the choice of whether to pay it? Carol Danvers, at least the Carol of Earth 616, the primary MCU timeline, has apparently been warned about this. At some point between the events of the films, she understood that moving too freely through the multiverse carries consequences that accumulate not only in the traveller, but in the fabric of the realities they pass through. The responsible stewardship of multiversal capability is not a question of power. It is a question of restraint, of knowing how to move lightly through a space that cannot absorb unlimited traffic without structural compromise. Sit with that. Let it breathe in the room around you. There is something recognizable in the incursion warning, not the physics of it, the soap bubble membranes and the timeline mechanics, but the underlying principle that the way you move through a space changes the space, that some forms of presence are extractive, that moving through other people's lives or other people's worlds with insufficient care for what your passage costs them is its own form of damage, even when the movement itself was motivated by something genuine. The incursion, in this light, is not just a multiverse concept. It is a story about the difference between influence and invasion, between connection and imposition. The Illuminati missed this distinction in their execution of Strange. They treated him as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood, and in doing so confirmed in miniature the same failure of empathy that the incursion mechanic describes at the universal scale. What the MCU needs, what the accumulated weight of all these multiverse stories is building toward, is something that can hold the full complexity of infinite reality without collapsing it, without extracting from it, without imposing on it the will of any single intelligence, however extraordinary, however well-intentioned, however justified by its own record of being right. The dream-walking sequence in Multiverse of Madness, Strange inhabiting the decaying body of his variant from Earth 838, the one the Illuminati executed, walking that corpse through the streets of a world that mourned him, is one of the MCU's most genuinely strange images. Strange in a dead man's body, Strange using a dead man's eyes to see a world that killed him, moving through it with the specific determination of someone who has decided that the cost of what he is doing is acceptable and will deal with the accounting later. The third eye appears because it must. The Darkhold's corruption is not a moral judgment. It does not punish bad people and spare good ones. It marks the places where reality has been bent past the angle that reality is designed to sustain. Strange is a good person using the Darkhold for reasons that are, by any reasonable analysis, justified. The Darkhold does not care. The third eye is the universe's notation in the margin. This happened here. The membrane was stressed at this point. File this under costs incurred. What Strange does with the third eye, how he holds its presence in his face, how he wakes in the morning and exists in the world with this mark of multiversal overreach permanently visible, is a question the MCU has not yet fully answered. He is seen in the Multiverse of Madness post-credits scene stepping through a portal opened by a woman in purple, heading into what appears to be the dark dimension, the third eye open. He has decided apparently to lean into whatever the third eye means rather than treating it as a problem to be solved. This is either wisdom or recklessness, and the story has not yet told us which. The incursion problem, taken to its logical conclusion, means that every act of multiversal travel carries a cost that someone else pays. America Chavez punching through a universe creates micro-stresses that accumulate. Every tempad jump degraded something infinitesimally. Every dreamwalk bent the membrane a fraction further. The sacred timeline's pruning methodology, for all its injustice, at least prevented the accumulation of these stresses by simply not allowing the movement to happen. In a free multiverse, a multiverse where the branches are growing back and the incursion risks are propagating, the responsible use of multiversal capability becomes one of the defining ethical challenges of any civilization with access to it. This is the challenge the MCU is positioning its next generation of heroes to face. Not the challenge of being powerful enough, not the challenge of being brave enough, the challenge of being careful enough, of understanding that the way you move through the world, any world, this one or the ones adjacent to it, leaves traces in the fabric of what you move through. That capability without corresponding care is not neutrally powerful. It is destructive by default, in the specific way that a strong person who doesn't pay attention to their strength damages things without meaning to. The incursion warning is therefore also a warning about the kind of heroism the multiverse requires. Not the heroism of overwhelming force applied to overwhelming threat. The heroism of restraint. Of choosing not to act when action would feel easier and more satisfying than the alternative. Of sitting with the discomfort of a problem that cannot be solved by doing something, only by being something. Something patient, something light-footed, something that has learned, through whatever process teaches such things, to move through the infinite without leaving more damage than the infinite can absorb. The Reed Richards of Earth 838 could calculate the risk. He could not calculate the cost. He who remains could see the probabilities. He could not sit still with the uncertainty. The TVA could manage the timeline. It could not permit the timeline to breathe. The answer that the multiverse saga is working toward is not a more powerful hero. It is a different kind of heroism. One that looks less like control and more like, and here we use a word carefully because it is overused and undervalued, wisdom. The specific kind of wisdom that comes not from knowing the most, but from being willing to sit in the space between knowing and not knowing, and choosing care over certainty. Your breath is very slow now. The room is holding you gently. You don't have to solve this. You only have to hear it. Let it move through you like water through deep stone. And trust that whatever it leaves behind is useful. One more movement. The final one. The place where we have been going since we first closed our eyes and let the dark receive us. Breathe and follow. Here we are, the last room, the deepest room, the one that has been waiting at the bottom of all this dark like a place you have visited before in sleep, familiar without being locatable, comfortable without being explainable. You are almost there. You are already almost there. Just let the voice carry you the rest of the way. Everything we have moved through tonight was prologue, not in the dismissive sense, not as preamble that can be skipped. Prologue, in the truest sense, the material that gives the story its weight, its context, its reason to be. Without the sacred timeline, the fracturing has no cost. Without He Who Remains, Sylvie's blade has no meaning. Without Loki's centuries of performing detachment, his final stillness at the loom of time has no earned beauty. Without Wanda's losses, her rage is merely spectacle. The prologue is the story. The context is the content. But we've arrived at the point the title has been building toward. The fight for timeline control has not ended. It has, in the most precise sense, just begun. Here is the state of the multiverse as it currently stands, narrated to you in the frequency of something very close to sleep. The sacred timeline is broken. The branches are growing. Every Nexus event that would once have been pruned within hours is now propagating freely, becoming its own timeline, becoming the world that some version of some person gets to live in. This is, depending on how you hold it, either the greatest act of liberation in the history of any universe, or the opening of a door that Kang the Conqueror walked through centuries ago in his own timeline and looked back at with something like anticipation. The Secret Wars, the event toward which the collected weight of the multiverse saga appears to be building, is, in the comic mythology, a moment in which the multiverse collapses into itself, in which incursions have accumulated beyond the threshold of repair, in which the membranes between realities have worn thin enough that the collisions can no longer be prevented, in which everything that was branching and diverging and proliferating is suddenly pressed together into one final, contested space. Battle world, the last world, made of pieces of all the others, governed by the being powerful enough to hold it all together, which in the comics is a Doom who has taken the power of the Beyonders and become something beyond any previous definition of God. The MCU will not follow this exactly. It never does. The adaptation is always a translation rather than a copy, the same narrative DNA expressed through a different cultural syntax, in a medium that has its own grammar and its own relationship to its audience. But the shape of the thing will rhyme. There will be a contraction. There will be a point at which the branching multiverse, freed from He Who Remains management and battered by the Kang Dynasty's war, produces enough incursions that the boundaries between realities cease to be meaningful. And in that collapse, the question that has been building across the entire saga will demand its answer. Who gets to decide what survives? This is why the fight for timeline control has just begun. Because the previous fight, the one He Who Remains, won by pruning everything back to one strand, was won by the wrong method. It addressed the symptom rather than the cause. The cause is not the existence of multiple timelines. The cause is the absence of any framework for the multiple timelines to coexist without colliding. He Who Remains' solution was to eliminate the multiple. But Loki's solution, holding the branches open, allowing the proliferation, sitting at the end of time in the posture of a guardian rather than a controller, can only be one piece of the answer, because it addresses the proliferation problem without addressing the incursion problem. The incursion problem requires something different. It requires beings in different timelines to exist in relationship to each other without the relationship becoming competitive, without the proximity generating the kind of pressure that makes membranes wear thin. This is not a technical problem. It is a relational one. And relational problems are not solved by the tools that solve technical problems. They are solved by something older and harder to systematize, something that requires not just intelligence but the particular kind of maturity that intelligence alone does not produce. Loki holds the branches. This is not a permanent solution in the way that stories about individuals usually offer permanent solutions. Loki is one being, at the end of time, holding the weight of infinity. And that image is beautiful and true, and also the image of a burden that cannot be carried forever without cost. The question of what happens when Loki's hold weakens, or what happens if Kang's council finds a way to reach the Citadel, or what happens when the incursions that are already accumulating in the branching timelines begin to produce collisions, these questions have not been answered. They have been posed. The Avengers as we knew them are gone. Steve Rogers lived his full life in another branch and came back old. Tony Stark is buried. Natasha Romanoff will not be retrieved from the void where the Soul Stone was earned. Thor is somewhere in the galaxy, carrying the particular loneliness of someone who has outlived everyone they were formed by. The team that held the center of the primary timeline through 3 phases of the MCU no longer exists as a functioning unit. What exists instead is something more complicated and in some ways more interesting. A scatter of individuals, each carrying their own piece of the multiverse problem. Strange, with his third eye and his accumulated debt to the fabric of reality. Wanda's example, her power, her failure, her final choice. A warning and a lesson simultaneously. Peter Parker, invisible in his own world, starting over with nothing, carrying the specific grace of someone who has lost everything and not become cruel. Kamala Khan, Kate Bishop, Sam Wilson's Captain America, Shang-Chi, Yelena Belova. A new generation defined not by the certainties of the previous one, but by the specific uncertainty of a moment when the rules of reality are being renegotiated in real time. Breathe, very slowly. You're so close to the edge of sleep. Just let the breath go when it wants to go. What the multiverse needs now, and this is the thing that this entire night of story has been building toward, the thing that sits underneath all the theory and the spectacle and the grief, what the multiverse needs now is not a new He Who Remains, not a more powerful Illuminati, not a better algorithm for predicting and containing Nexus events. What it needs is the thing that Loki, alone at the end of time, demonstrated, the willingness to hold without controlling, to be present to the weight of infinite possibility without needing to reduce it to something manageable, to say, all of this gets to exist, even the branches that are difficult, even the variants who are dangerous, even the versions of events that do not resolve cleanly, all of it, the whole wild branching river of everything. This is not passive. Holding is not the same as surrendering. Loki at the loom is not absent. He is profoundly, attentively present, more present than he has ever been in his long and complicated life. He is simply present in a way that serves the thing he is holding rather than imposing his will upon it. That distinction between presence that serves and presence that dominates is the most important distinction the multiverse saga has to offer. And it is not, when you trace it carefully, only a distinction about heroes and timelines and the fate of reality. It is a distinction about how any person can be in relation to anything that is larger than their capacity to control. A grief, a relationship, a life, a night. Like this one in which the thoughts will not stay quiet and the body wants rest and the two are not yet fully reconciled. You cannot control the night. You can only be in it. You can only breathe in it. You can only let it do the thing it knows how to do, which is receive you. All of you. The complicated branching version of yourself that contains multitudes, that has taken different paths at different forks. That is not the same person who began tonight and will not be the same person who ends it. The fight for timeline control is not over. It will not be over for a long time, not in the story and not in any life that resembles it, but tonight, in this room, in this particular branch of this particular night. The fight is suspended. The timeline can take care of itself for a few hours. The multiverse is vast enough to permit one small person to rest. The MCU's next phase is, in a sense, the attempt to find characters who carry that maturity, who've been through enough to know the difference between power and wisdom, who have made the mistakes that teach you what the mistakes cost, and have received the teaching without being destroyed by it. Peter Parker, starting over with nothing and still choosing to be Spider-Man. Sam Wilson picking up the shield knowing it was not designed for someone who looks like him, and choosing to carry it anyway. These are not technically extraordinary figures. They are morally extraordinary ones, and in the context of a threat that cannot be solved by technical means, Moral extraordinariness turns out to be the relevant category. You breathe. In this room, in this particular branch, in the small and specific reality of your own life, you breathe. And somewhere in the branching infinite, versions of you are also breathing, carrying different things, having chosen differently at different forks. Some of them are sleeping already, some of them are still awake, still in the corridor between wakefulness and rest, still listening to a story that has not quite finished saying everything it has to say. All of them are real. All of them are allowed. The multiverse does not require you to be the best version of yourself. It only requires you to be the one you actually are, in this branch, in this body, in this night. That is enough. That has always been enough. The fight for timeline control is just beginning, but you're not required to fight it tonight. Tonight you only need to drift, to release the grip, to let the branch carry you where it carries you, into whatever morning waits at the end of this darkness. Sleep. The multiverse is very large. Your portion of it is very small and very quiet and entirely, for these few hours, yours. You have permission to rest. The branches will still be there in the morning. The Kangs will still be somewhere in the infinite planning. Loki will still be at the loom, holding. Strange will wake with his third eye and his questions. Sylvie will be somewhere in a timeline she is slowly learning to call home. And you will wake also, with whatever the night has returned to you from the place where all the things you cannot control are gently, temporarily, released. For now, nothing is required. The dark is friendly. The weight of your body is the most honest thing in the room. It knows exactly what it needs, and it is asking very quietly, and the answer is simply to stop and breathe and fall. Fall now. The multiverse will catch you. It always does. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments. Sleep well. The branch is attended. The night is long, and it belongs entirely to you.